Welcome to Rebuilding American Capitalism and American Compass Forum. My name is Jonathan Barron, board member of American Compass, and I'm going to date myself. The first time I think I visited this room, maybe this building, was 1987, so I'm a real outsider. I've mainly been in Washington ever since, which means I've come across a lot of groups and squads and think tanks and action tanks and waves and trends and all kinds of different movements. And I would argue that I cannot recall a policy organization that has made a bigger impact faster than American Compass. And Oren Cass, along with his colleagues, deserve tremendous credit for really making a mark on the Washington, D.C. policy scene. And I'm not going to invoke complex economic theory to buttress my case. I'm just going to point to the size of this audience, as well as the senators who will be participating in the course of this afternoon's conversation. And although it is uncertain how the debate on conservatism will unfold, I think it is certain that Senators Rubio, Young, and Vance will play a central role in that debate, and we're grateful they would be joining us this afternoon for the conversation. And these senators are not just elected leaders. I would argue they are true policy innovators, and they will play a key part in conservatism's long-term success. Now, a word about Oren, and I know Oren through some of his college roommates, so I'm not going to get into that material. This is a family program. But I've known Oren for more than a decade, and I have to say he possesses many, many impressive qualities. But I would argue perhaps the most noteworthy is a fearless intellectual honesty. And that virtue, more than anything else, probably explains Oren and American Compass's remarkable achievements. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce American Compass's founder and executive director, Oren Cass.
Well, thank you everyone so much for being here. This is pretty incredible. You know, we started American Compass, I guess a little over 3 years ago now, and I had high hopes, but my hopes were not this high. And so I first of all want to just acknowledge a bunch of folks. First of all, the board, Jonathan Barron, Ambassador Lighthizer, Neil Patel, Mike Needham, Julius Krein, David Azarad. They filter out the 95% of my bad ideas before the 5% make it into the world. Our donors, especially our Navigators Guild, who make any of what we do possible. Our Compass advisors, who we've finally been able to announce publicly, many of whom are here. I think one of my favorite things about this project is only about half the book is by us. The other half is by folks who are at a wide range of institutions around Washington, as importantly, far outside of Washington, who are all doing the incredible work that is allowing conservatism, I think, to frankly make a comeback and start to bring about what we need in American politics today. Most importantly, I want to thank my team. They've heard this many times, but many of you have not. We don't have an events team at American Compass. We just have a team. There's only 6 of us. One of them is in Japan right now. And so essentially everything you see that Compass does, that we're able to do at an event like this, is from an incredibly small group of people, most of whom are, well, all of whom are asked to do 3 or 4 jobs at a time. And it takes an extraordinary commitment to our mission to being able to be willing to do that. And so I just want to acknowledge, first of all, Wells King and Wes Hodges, who helped start this thing when it was on a napkin. They are now, Wells is Senator Vance's senior policy advisor, Wes is at Heritage. And the current team, Chris Griswold, Abby Salvatore, Emily Davis, Duncan Braid, and Gabriela Rodriguez. It would just be me blogging in my basement without them. So thank you guys for everything that you do to get us here. So this is pretty cool. And in my mind, it is a testament ultimately to the idea that ideas matter. I'm an ideas matter guy. I incredibly appreciate Jonathan's comment about intellectual honesty, because with no coordination, that is exactly what I wanted to talk about. The philosophies of American Compass is that if you have better ideas, if you have the most thoughtful people, if you work harder than everybody else, and you have just obsessive integrity in how you behave, you can win, even in Washington. Um, and that is, I think, what we've done. We don't do junior high politics. We don't question people's motives. We don't do personal attacks. We have one operating principle, which is personal civility and intellectual combat. And that means we will pick any fight, we will prosecute any case if we think it's right until everybody else is absolutely miserable and can't believe we're still talking. But I think that we have proved that even here, if those ideas are the right ones, people will listen. And so what are those ideas? For us, they fall under the umbrella of what we call conservative economics. And conservative economics it's pretty simple at the end of the day. It comes down to two premises. One is that the market is for something, that you actually have to be willing to define a substantive good that you think you want to achieve. And for conservatives, I think, fortunately, we have a very good sense of what that is. We want strong families and strong communities supporting a strong nation. We want people able to contribute productively. We want them to be able to raise the next generation able to do the same thing. And either markets are going to make that possible, or they're not. And if they don't, you're going to have to ask government to do it. And that's not the answer that we want. And so that's the second principle, which is that we are actually going to have public policies that make markets work. That markets will not necessarily of their own accord achieve that substantive good. And so if that is our ultimate goal, then policymakers have an unavoidable role in making the rules, setting the constraints, building the institutions that are going to shape the way that markets act. And the core of our argument in rebuilding American capitalism is that essentially only conservatives can do it. That progressives aren't going to do it. They frankly disdain much about capitalism and are more than happy to say, actually, we have a public program that will do what the market will not. And libertarians aren't going to do it because they believe the market always works, no matter what, and whatever the outcome is the best one that you could hope for. And so it, I think, falls to conservatives to figure this out. And the fact that conservatives have been pushed out of the economic policy space for so long, I think is a fairly good explanation of why we have gone so far astray. And so what you have before you in this book that we've put out, what we're looking forward to talking with these senators about is the basic case for what has gone wrong and what can be done. And the what has gone wrong is incredibly important. And even before that, conceding that something has gone wrong. You know, tomorrow morning I'll be at the American Enterprise Institute for a debate with folks who are still putting forward the argument that actually things are great, that the family is thriving more than it ever has, the economic conditions are better than they have ever been. And there are certainly those on the right who take that view. And if you take that view, then that's sort of the end. We can head back over to the cookies. But I think a dispassionate view of the data and any awareness of just what is going on in America today and over the last decade or two forces you to acknowledge that can't be right. That markets are not delivering the conditions that we need for the kind of flourishing that we want. And so then step two is why is that? If we're going to solve it, we need a diagnosis. And for us, the diagnosis is that capitalism is not working the way that it should, the way that it can, because we don't have the correct alignment between things that generate a lot of profit and things that are good for people. That's the central insight of the invisible hand. The invisible hand is not magical. The invisible hand doesn't say whatever happens, markets work. The invisible hand says that if the things that are going to produce the most profit are also things that are good for the public interest, then people pursuing profit will serve the public interest. It's frankly closer to a truism than it is to some deep insight. It was a description of something that seemed to be happening in the world. And when we look around today, what we see is the things that generate the most profit for American entrepreneurs are not things especially good for the nation. That's not an indictment of the entrepreneurs. They're doing what they're supposed to do, make as much money as they can within certain bounds. But if offshoring is going to be more profitable than creating jobs in America, if starting a hedge fund is going to be more profitable than starting a company that actually makes something, If building an app is going to be more profitable than building something in the real world, that's what people are going to do, and that's what they have been doing. And so the first part of the solution from our perspective is to address that, is to recognize that not all markets are productive ones, and that if you want markets to be productive, you have to have the right constraints in place. You have to have forces that channel that pursuit of profit toward the public good. And we focus on three pieces. We focus first on globalization, on the question of how big the market even is. And we recognize that workers in America are pretty much stuck here, right? Workers aren't going to go get a job in China, and frankly, there are a lot of reasons we wouldn't advise that. If you have a situation where the workers are stuck here and the capital can go anywhere it wants, you don't have the right conditions for capital to actually invest in workers. And so reimposing those constraints, telling capital in America you need to work with the workers in America, is an important piece of this. The second piece that we focus on is industry, recognizing that building things in the real world is a lot harder, riskier, might not have as high as a return as building software. And so if we want that industry, we need public policies that reward it. Third is financialization and taking on the problem of Wall Street and a tremendous amount of economic activity that has no value in the real world. We call it investment when somebody buys a stock. Buying a stock is not investment. Buying a stock is simply moving assets around in circles. Investment is when capital actually goes to a company and gets invested in something that creates more productive capacity. And we need to focus Wall Street back on that task. So that's one half, productive markets. The second half is supportive communities. How do we have educational institutions that actually prepare people for the workplace? How do we have families that are actually able to form, able to thrive, and then ultimately able to prepare people for the world? And finally, how do we have a labor movement that actually represents workers effectively, not endorses the sitting president, what are we, 18 months prior to election day? Conservatives need to find a way to build that kind of labor movement, one that gives workers real power, but that advances the interests that workers themselves actually care about. And so I'm incredibly honored that Senator Cotton, Senator Young, Senator Rubio, and Senator Vance are going to join us today. We will invariably cover all sorts of topics, but in general, we're going to address the education piece with Senator Cotton, industry with Senator Young, globalization with Senator Rubio, and both financialization and labor with Senator Vance. So we hope you find it informative. We hope you find it, frankly, exciting and engaging, because if all goes well, this is where conservatism is headed. So thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, I am really honored to introduce Senator Tom Cotton to come up and get us started.
Thank you all very much for the warm welcome. Thank you, Oren, for the introduction and the invitation to speak here today. It's a pleasure to be speaking to policy innovators at the American Compass. You know, sometimes it can feel like a new think tank opens up every day in Washington. I'll just be honest with you. You might say they're almost like Dunkin' Donuts in Oren's home state of Massachusetts on every corner. But some are more successful than others. When American Compass first opened its doors 3 years ago, there were no doubt some critics that were predicting that it would be like many other think tanks, that it would burn bright short after a grand opening and then disappear into the headlines. Probably some critics who were hoping that as well. But that hasn't been the path that American Compass has taken. Under Oren's leadership and with the help of a small group of dedicated policy experts, American Compass has punched far above its weight. It's distinguished itself as a think tank that is genuinely thoughtful. And American Compass is pioneering new, right policies that put American workers and families first. I'm especially grateful for your support to my office as we crafted the American Workforce Act, a bill which would transform American secondary education to prioritize the millions of working Americans who are left behind by the current system. For decades, America has bankrolled a college-for-all higher education system that has failed too many of our young people, stretched our families beyond the financial breaking point, and burdened generations of citizens with unsustainable debt. Nearly 2 in 5 college graduates say they regret their choice major. More than 2 in 5 of recent college graduates are underemployed, and more than half of graduates work in fields they didn't even study. Yet, in the past 20 years, tuition prices have risen by more than 180%, and total student loan debt is now nearing $2 trillion. At the same time, college endowments have now grown to over $800 billion in value, with colleges like Harvard and Yale sitting on more than $70 billion. As their vast untaxed fortunes have swelled, so have their bloated bureaucracies. Between 1976 and 2018, total student enrollment increased by 78%, while the number of college administrators ballooned by 616%. This is nothing short of an academic gilded age, enriching entitled ivory tower elites at the expense of normal, hardworking Americans. While poorly serving college students and graduates, the current system also neglects worker education. More than 3 in 5 Americans over the age of 25 don't have a 4-year college degree. But the federal government currently spends about 8 times as much on higher education as on workforce training. And the Biden administration now wants to transfer approximately $500 billion of debt from college graduates onto the backs of hardworking Americans. The American Workforce Act would rebalance this unequal treatment and take the first step towards leveling the educational caste system that colleges and universities have sought to construct. My bill would provide Americans without a college degree with vouchers worth up to $9,000, which they can use to help pay for employer-led training programs. Trainees would learn from employers of their choosing who offer full-time jobs that pay a wage of at least 80% of the median household income for a given area, which would ensure that these workers get high-paying jobs at the end of their training, which too often doesn't happen after a 4-year degree. And at the end of the program, employers would also earn a $1,000 bonus if they chose to hire the trainee. This initiative would be open to citizens of all ages and backgrounds, from young adults looking to enter the workforce after high school, to mothers re-entering the workforce after raising children, to ex-convicts trying to restart their lives. Instead of dividing workers and businesses, like Democrats are so fond of doing, this legislation brings them together in a close and cooperative relationship. It upskills workers, ensuring higher wages, while filling critical workforce gaps for businesses and ensuring higher productivity. The initial cost of the American Workforce Act will be paid for by a tax on elite college endowments. Ivy League academics are fond of calling for the rich to pay their fair share. In this case, I'm sure they'll readily leap at the opportunity to lead by example and pay their fair share. This summer, I'll be reintroducing the American Workforce Act, and I look forward to continuing to work with American Compass to have this important legislation passed into law. Thank you all very much for allowing me to address you.
So, Senator, I think you outlined the case incredibly well. You've been a tremendous leader on this question of non-college pathways. Obviously, it's an area where we are very much in agreement. One question I think that comes up a lot that I wanted to pose to you is, what ultimately is the role for government here? When you think about why we would want any policy, what the ideal end state is, what would you like to see policy doing, and why should it be doing it?
Well, I think we have to start with where government policy is today, which puts an extremely heavy thumb on the scale of four-year college education. And that may be right for some people. Many people thrive in college, they get a good education, they get a good job afterwards. But I think the numbers prove that for more Americans, that's not the right choice. Those who choose not to go to college, those who go to college and don't complete it, those who go to college and regret their choices, either their major or going at all, based on the statistics I cited. If the government is going to continue to support the four-year college path, I think we also need to do right by the majority of young Americans who don't make that choice. And simply put, apprenticeship programs or workforce training programs today are not sufficiently supported by the government. They're too bureaucratic, and they're not geared to the needs of actual companies that need actual workers, as opposed to bureaucratic constructs in Washington, D.C. And that's going to vary. That's going to vary in my state of Arkansas. In South Arkansas, companies might need workers to go out and work in the oil patch or in the forests. In Northwest Arkansas, they may need workers working in retail and supply chains. In East Arkansas, it may be in agricultural production. Obviously, it's going to differ in other parts of the nation as well. I think that the driving point of the American Workforce Act from the employer standpoint is they get to customize that training, and they get to use the voucher that their trainees to use to offset it, so they don't take the risk of starting a big program that's not going to pan out or won't get support through current cumbersome government programs. And then at the end of it, they'll get trained, skilled workers who are specifically prepared for the jobs that they need, not hypothetical or abstract jobs that some bureaucrat might have approved.
And how do you see in Arkansas, as an example, the status quo? We obviously have some folks for whom the system works very well. We call them the fortunate fifth, the 1 in 5 who go high school, college, relevant degree into a career, no problem supporting a family there. If you think about the folks who drop out along the way, don't have the kind of thing the American Workforce Act might provide, how would you characterize their economic situation? Relative in the past, relative to what you would aspire to for them?
Well, I mean, in some ways, Arkansas is doing very well right now. We have record low unemployment. We still have unfilled jobs. This is one thing that the American Workforce Act would help address, is creating more skilled workers to take those jobs, as opposed to the constant and wrong-headed clamor about more and more immigration, especially unskilled and low-skilled immigration. And our universities, I would submit, are much better than a lot of universities around the country at actually focusing on educating young Arkansans and getting them ready for the workforce, in addition to being good citizens. But the fact of the matter still is that just more Arkansans are going to not go to those universities than are going to go to them. And our government simply doesn't do enough to support their choices and their career paths versus what we're doing for those college-educated Arkansans. And that's the case all around the country.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about the sort of the set of opportunities that do exist in one state versus another, and the need to customize which best comes from the employer, not from a central program design. Would you also want to see a change in what that set of opportunities is? Do you feel like we have the right kinds of investment and mix of businesses to begin with, or is there also a component here of we need to be creating different or better jobs as well?
So I think that's part of a bigger conversation, and I know you're going to be discussing it with some of my peers later today, and American Compass has done great work on this, but we need to get back to making stuff in this country. Certainly making more stuff than we do now, even if we don't end up making as much stuff as we once did, and especially the kind of stuff that is absolutely critical to our country's safety and our prosperity. Some of that is very high-skilled manufacturing, very advanced technological manufacturing, like semiconductor manufacturing. But some of it is products that we used to make here that we outsourced almost entirely to countries like China, who are trying to displace us as the world superpower, that allow them to hold our country at risk. You know, I think we all remember in the early days of the pandemic probably being surprised about how much basic medical equipment and basic pharmaceutical ingredients are made in China. I don't mean cutting-edge cancer therapies that are just on the verge of being approved. I mean things like penicillin and acetaminophen and ibuprofen and latex gloves and so forth. So we have obviously a huge and very successful services sector in America, and we export a lot of services in our country. But in the end, a healthy and balanced economy also needs to produce goods that people are going to buy or that other businesses are going to buy to produce their own goods. And I think our economy has gotten out of balance over the last 30 to 40 years, and I think failed education and workforce training policy partly contributes to that, partly as a result of it.
Yeah, that's it. That vicious cycle point is when we try to make a lot, that it's not only that we need to be preparing the workers for the jobs, it's that if you're an employer today, and let's say you're running a software company, almost everyone you're trying to hire has gotten to go through heavily subsidized higher education, maybe even heavily subsidized postgraduate work. If you're trying to hire somebody in a blue-collar field, you basically have folks coming out of high school. They certainly weren't prepared in high school in any way, and then you're just slapped on the wrist for not doing it all yourself. Do you see this? American Workforce Act is primarily post-high school. It's sort of as an alternative to college. To what extent would you want to or consider bringing that even into the high school side of things and having pathways there?
Well, I wouldn't want to move on to one goal before we make the first goal. And I think the higher education system is where reform is most needed. But I can remember, and I think many of you can probably remember, that there were vocational and technical schools where I grew up, and people as early as 15 and 16 years old started going to those for at least a couple periods a day. They had already kind of made the choice that they didn't want a four-year degree. That wasn't a path for them. Maybe there were industries in your community where they wanted to go work. Their parents or their older brothers and sisters, their friends had worked there, and they knew it provided a good, stable job to support their way of life in their own communities. So you can envision, once we take the step of reforming the higher education system, of trying to extend it to the secondary education system as well. Of course, many countries already do that, very successful industrialized economies, especially in Europe. Places like Switzerland and Germany recognize the value of beginning to train young workers before they get out of the secondary education system into the industries that help drive those countries' economies. And those are, like I said, fairly advanced, successful industrial democracies as well. They've taken a very different path than what we have, and I think there's a lot that you can learn from them.
What do you say to people who see this as somehow constraining opportunity or sort of shuttling people away from college as, President Obama always used to call it the ticket to the middle class? Is this inequitable? Why isn't it inequitable?
Yeah, so, and I think a lot of you probably, if you're close to Oren or my age, you may remember your parents or your teachers telling you that. 50 or 70 years ago, the numbers that Oren and I have cited were even more skewed against college. So the percentage of Americans who were getting college education were in the single digits, sometimes in some places in the low single digits. So it really was unusual, but today that's not nearly as much the case. The lucky fifth or the 2/5 or whatever, based on where you live and your college opportunities. But that also means that there's a higher degree of college graduates who are going after the same kind of jobs. It's why so many college graduates end up not working in the field they study, in addition to some fields just being made up and not actually having real jobs to work in as opposed to study. By contrast, look at some of the skills you can learn through vocational or technical or workforce training. In Arkansas, you get a highly skilled HVAC technician or plumber or carpenter. They're apt to make more than twice the median income of an Arkansan, sometimes 3 times as much. That can be true in skilled trades and other industries as well. And some of those things, they may not be recession-proof, but they are certainly outsourcing-proof. You can't fix your HVAC in China. You can't have a carpenter add on to your home in China. So there's a lot of security in addition to high compensation that comes in a lot of these working class jobs that too many people in Washington have looked down their nose at or create an education system that doesn't prioritize.
What about the employer perspective then? I'm sure you speak to them constantly. Concepts like the skills gap come up a lot. I think in the popular dialogue, skills gap is interpreted to mean doesn't know how to code. What is it that employers are looking for, do you think?
I think employers are looking for the skills that they need in their work sites. And that may even be different from one industry to another. You know, we have a large defense industrial plant in South Arkansas, and most of the major contractors are there. But they do slightly different kind of things. You know, what Raytheon needs in Camden may be different from what Lockheed needs. And the American Workforce Act does not try to put a one-size-fits-all solution on the entire country, the entire state, even a single industrial park. It's really up to the employer to decide what kind of skills they need to train their workers on and give their workers that training. Because one of the constant things I hear when I talk to employers on the one hand and local community colleges or technical training schools is the challenges they have, even though they both have the best of intentions, in getting the training just right to fit what they need. And my legislation would kind of cut that Gordian knot by allowing the employers to set it for themselves. And then the people who are going through the training, which may take some time and maybe some commitment on the behalf of the trainees, know that when they get out of it, this employer has a huge incentive to hire them, not just a $1,000 bonus for hiring them, but because they have created the exact worker they need.
Yeah, and community college is exactly the next piece in this constellation. I think there's, in some respects, rightly a tremendous amount of criticism of our community colleges when you look at things like completion rate, incomes after graduation even. Many of them can look quite poor. The flip side is they're an incredible resource. And if you think sort of nationwide about what are the institutions we have, these community colleges, they look like they could be just the right thing. And so do you see them as typically the right partners here, or is there more to do to get them doing what we need?
So like I said, in my experience, our community colleges and our businesses work very well together. They have the very best of intentions, but sometimes it may not always be the perfect fit for each kind of employer. So again, the way to cut that Gordian knot is to let the employer make that decision. In some cases, they may want to create a customized training program on their own site, using their own equipment, with their own supervisory personnel. In other cases, it may be close enough with a community college that they may want to work in tandem with that community college to create a program that the community college can produce. And I think some of the statistics that sometimes give them criticism are unwarranted because if the point of many of these programs is to help people find a job that is high paying and has good security in their community, and they can find one without completing every single requirement of that community college, should they really continue on? I mean, to use a layman's example, if you're a college athlete and you're playing SEC football after 3 years and you're capable of being drafted in the NFL, do you really need to continue on for your 4th year and get your degree? I mean, in a way, you could say that the 3 years you've spent in the Razorback football program that's prepared you to be a first or second or third round draft pick has kind of gotten you to the point where you have the skills you need and you're ready to go out and get a very high paying job. So I think sometimes there's criticism of our community colleges that are unwarranted because we're looking at measures of success from the wrong perspective.
Yeah, fair enough. I won't question the Arkansas football team either. That would get me in trouble very quickly, I suspect. What about the higher education side of it then? Because we're obviously still going to have an awful lot of people going to college. We want to have a lot of people going to college. I think when you talk about too many people going today, or just the incredible agglomeration of resources that maybe they don't need or aren't being well spent, there are huge gains to be had by shifting some of those elsewhere. What else are you thinking about in terms of how to make it work for the people it can and should work for?
Well, first off, the way the American Workforce Act would fund these programs, as I mentioned, through a small tax on the endowments of just a handful of the largest and wealthiest universities. I mean, in some cases, it might be fair to say that these are really hedge funds with left-wing colleges attached to them as a vanity project. The reason why those colleges and universities have the tax exemption is they can put that money to good purpose, to support education, to pay tuition, to provide new facilities like dining halls or dormitories or what have you. It's not there so they can just continue to build ever larger investment vehicles when they're not putting as much towards their students' education as they could. College is a choice for each individual person and their parents. Sometimes, like I said, it's the right choice to make. Sometimes I think it's the wrong choice, or at least it's a premature choice for an 18-year-old. I can't generalize about any specific choice on that, but I stress again that over the last 30 or 40 years, education policy has put much too heavy a thumb on the scale for four-year degrees, which oftentimes are not completed, or they don't provide you relevant skills, or get you a decent job. And we need to rebalance that scale toward all those, which are a majority of Americans still, a large majority, who are not going to go to college.
I want to wrap up zooming out a little bit and thinking about everything that's been going on in conservatism in recent years, thinking about some of these economic policy issues. Really something of an open-ended question. I'm very curious, how your thinking has changed, if at all, and things you focus more on than you used to. What is on your mind when it comes to how we should be doing economic policy?
Well, I think the Republican Party has been moving for a long time into representing a working class coalition. The Democrats still have this image of themselves as, being as Joe Biden would put it, a lunch bucket Democrat, on behalf of the working man. They're carrying his lunch pail to the job site. That's just almost not ever the case anymore. The Democratic Party has been become increasingly a party of a class of well-educated elites working in large metropolitan areas, working on the coast. That's not universally true, but it is generally true. This is not something that happened because Donald Trump was elected president. It was accelerated, perhaps, but I think his presidency is more the result of that movement than it is the cause of it. You can see some beginnings of it as early as Ronald Reagan. But especially by the time George Bush was elected, George Bush the younger, if you look at the coalition that elected him and the way he appealed to voters in those two campaigns and the way that Democrats put together their coalition, that this is something that's been continuing on for probably going back to the mid-'80s at least. And I think that's a healthy thing. It's a healthy thing from a policy standpoint because, as we've been discussing here, most Americans don't have college educations. They oftentimes are working with their hands and working on their feet. They got to take a shower after they get off work, not before they go to work. And politically, it's a good thing as well because that's a majority. That's an incipient majority, still waiting to be fully assembled. We've done it at certain times over the last 40 years. But I think if we're more attentive to the needs of working class Americans to help them achieve their aspirations, then I think it'll go from being an incipient majority into an actual and durable majority.
We hope so as well. This has been terrific. I have to let you go. You have an NDA markup in just a few minutes, but I think your leadership on this issue and just your willingness to really bring a thoughtful sort of from first principles perspective on policy making has been tremendously important for conservatism, for the Republican Party, and we thank you for all the work you're doing. So
well, thank you,
for
Oren.
being
Thanks
here.
to American Compass.
I'm delighted to switch now over to Senator Todd Young, who has been, I think, a remarkable leader on a range of issues that it'll be interesting to talk about. One that's been especially important is semiconductor policy. He was a real leader on the CHIPS and Science Act, both on the semiconductor piece and the need for a greater role in federal policy for research and development generally, and in a completely different realm on non-compete agreements, recognizing that workers are not always getting a fair shake when it comes to the terms of employment, and that there actually is a role for policy in standing up for workers in that context. Those are exactly the kinds of policy, certainly, that we're enthusiastic about and that I think need to play a much bigger role in the conservative agenda. So delighted to introduce and welcome Senator Todd Young.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me, Oren. I am honored to be with all of you. and grateful for this invitation and for the thoughtful work of Oren Cass and American Compass. Rebuilding American capitalism provides a blueprint for the future of conservatism. It's not a hyphenated conservatism or a new conservatism. This is far from an exercise in rebranding from my perspective. Rather, it's a conservatism that, inspired by its principles, doesn't shy away from the responsibility of actually governing effectively and seeking solutions to America's most pressing challenges. Not the challenges of 40 years ago, but the challenges we're experiencing today. And this work is, of course, not simply about the future of conservatism, although it is to some degree about that. By rousing our movement to rise to this moment and giving it the intellectual materiel to do so, you're setting the stage for a second American century. Now, let me briefly go back a couple of centuries. In 1809, a pair of New York state legislators traveled to Washington. They had a meeting with Thomas Jefferson, then president. They had hoped to earn Jefferson's support for the construction of a long-discussed but yet unrealized canal linking the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. The president was inspired by the idea, but he couldn't quite support it. Quote, "It is a splendid project and may be executed a century hence, but it's a little short of madness to think of it at this day," unquote. Those were the words of Jefferson. Nearly a decade and a half later, in 1825, the Erie Canal was complete. The nation's economy and industries flourished in the years that followed. Though his wisdom was beyond dispute, this was a rare example of Jefferson's imagination letting him down. In this case, he underestimated the power of American innovation. Why do I share this anecdote? Well, it's a reminder, I hope, to all of us. It's a reminder that we conservatives should be careful not to suffer from our own lack of imagination today. We should never underestimate this nation's ingenuity. Right now, we need both. Look at the task before us. We have to adjust America's economy for a new century to find pathways for more workers to meaningfully participate in it, for families to benefit from it, for its wealth to spread more widely. Only if our citizens are reaching their potential can our nation outcompete China in the global struggle now underway. The future, after all, belongs to and will be governed by the values of the nation that innovates with the most urgency. History proves that. With faith in what the American people can accomplish with the right tools and without needless restraints, the hour calls for a policy framework that unleashes the dynamism that has appeared over and over across our own history. Renewed prosperity and national security will follow. Let's call it an innovation agenda. The first piece was put in place last year. Oren mentioned it. This was the bipartisan coalition assembled in Congress to pass the CHIPS and Science Act. It's both a national security and economic development investment in our people and our places, our intimate communities that have indeed been overlooked for too long. And it effectively put America on the offense against Beijing. That's because the CHIPS and Science Act secures our country, it gives our people the tools to flourish, and ensures America continues its global leadership role. Much of the funding goes toward ensuring that more Americans have the requisite skills to work in the industries of the future. That, of course, is semiconductors, but it's also hypersonic systems, artificial intelligence, autonomous systems. The law is already jump-starting semiconductor production here in the United States. An emerging domestic microchip industry will provide jobs, and it will prevent future supply chain stoppages and safeguard our military readiness. And it will, I believe, help bridge the economic opportunity gap that divides our citizens. Construction of a corridor of the semiconductor industry is already underway in the heartland in places like Indiana. The CHIPS and Science Act is a significant first component of an innovation agenda, but I believe it's only the first step. I hesitate to call our federal immigration laws a system, since that would imply some organization, some intent. But we have to bring what passes for our immigration system in line with our values and with our interests. That means ending the lawlessness and inhumanity at the southern border. That's the easy part. But it also means making more Americans out of high-skilled workers who seek to immigrate here illegally. Elsewhere, China dumps undervalued products and subsidizes its industries, distorting the free market and harming American workers. Their companies move portions of production to other countries to circumvent duties, a practice known as country hopping, hurting our domestic industries. Protecting American jobs and fighting back against China's unfair trade practices will require strengthening trade remedy laws. We also need to encourage more crucial research and development. That means allowing American businesses to fully deduct R&D expenses. Right now, if one of you owns a business located in China, you invest $100, you can deduct $200 from your taxes. Make that same investment on a business located right here on American soil, you deduct $10. That needs to be remedied. And we need to assist workers and entrepreneurs so they can freely apply their talents where their skills are in greatest demand by scaling back the overuse of non-compete agreements that negatively impact American workers. I am writing, or I have already introduced legislation to address every one of these challenges. But I want to also acknowledge other suggestions made in Rebuilding American Capitalism, including removing unnecessary red tape and regulation, slowing new infrastructure projects without eliminating important environmental protections, and encouraging more public-private investment in new American industry. To Oren and all of American Compass, your work will continue to inform our agenda. With your help, the future of conservatism will be built on high ideals, daring ideas, and I hope limitless imagination. Together, we will renew the American promise and guarantee that this remains the land of the free. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And you covered everything, so now I feel like it's open season. I can ask any question.
Just go for it.
Yeah. I want to start with a slightly bigger picture question, because I've really enjoyed when I've had the opportunity to speak with you the extent to which I think you really start from first principles and think about how do we actually think about the economy? What is the role of public policy? What are we trying to accomplish? And I think you really outlined that well as the basis for all of those policies. I'm curious if you don't mind sharing, how do conversations with your colleagues go about some of that? Where are the places where you find resistance to some of the things that you feel strongly about? What are the arguments that you find most persuasive, or that others find most persuasive when you make them?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness. I enjoy our conversations. And when I came into the Senate in 2017, I was in the early stages of a big rethink. I was trained, to the extent I'm trained conventionally in economics, I was trained at the University of Chicago. This is where Hayek did so much of his important work. This is where Milton Friedman made his name. This is where so many of us learned our economics. It germinated from the scholarship of the University of Chicago. And I knew at the point in life at which I attended business school at the University of Chicago, I didn't have the stamina or the metabolism to get a PhD in economics. So I concentrated on economics while getting an MBA, which is a bit of a fudge, but I have some fluency in economics.
I think most people would say it was an incredibly wise. It speaks well of your judgment that you.
Oh, thank you. So it was an amazing experience, but the models I learned, I have to admit, were starting to wear poorly. Right around the 2016-27 timeframe, and I think it took me a while to sort of pay attention to and trust my lying eyes. There were dying communities that needed reinvestment. Our dependency in the most manufacturing-intensive state in the country, which I represent, on other countries to make things that are essential to assemble automobiles and to assemble our phones and so forth. We were losing the capacity to make these things. Rank-and-file Hoosiers were telling me that lack of manufacturing capacity had national security implications, and somehow that didn't fit the economic model, perhaps best popularly articulated by the Wall Street Journal Ed Page. So, it takes a bit of courage, and in my case, maybe it took some exasperation, just being tired of not having adequate answers for many of my constituents, and not having my curiosity satisfied about why these traditional supply and demand curves were not addressing the needs on the ground. And so I did a lot of reading. I consulted with some heterodox thinkers around town, and I changed the model, at least in my head. And I'm constantly revisiting the model and trying to adjust it. So here's why I share that. I think all of my colleagues are either going through this process or must go through this process, or increasingly they're going to hear the blowback of their own constituents. Because the traditional economics still apply. Supply and demand are still, we must respect these forces, and the free market is something we have to continue to embrace. But we also need to know when the market breaks down. And if you can walk people from their traditional understanding of economics to explain when market failures are occurring and why they're occurring and how they need to be addressed, it actually works. But you almost always have to start there, because that's when your listener, your fellow Republican or fellow conservative, conversationalist is beginning in this journey. And it can apply to employer-employee relations, the non-compete agreements. It can apply to the weaponization of our supply chains by a state capitalist country, in which case your traditional comparative advantage analysis doesn't apply. But you really need to start where people are. Sales 101, like Dad taught me.
You would have been a good salesman, but we're glad you're here. So let's talk about the Chips and Science Act for a minute. I found it a fascinating case study in something that I think absolutely needed to be done, and also showed all the challenges with trying to do it. That is, I would be the first to concede to those who say, well, if you try to develop a policy to support a particularly important industry, you're going to have all of these special interests in there. You're going to have all these fights. And from my perspective, the answer is yes, you are. And the result isn't going to be perfect, but my gosh, it's better than nothing. I'm curious what sort of lessons you learned, what was harder than you expected, and if we are trying to do the same sort of thing over again in other contexts, what do we know now?
This was not an easy sell. And this was a difficult journey, right? It really was. And you're still selling. You're still trying to persuade people, even those that supported it, that they made the right decision. So let me first say that about the CHIPS and Science Act. But if you really spend a little time with this issue, it's pretty clear that you cannot run a modern economy without computer chips. And we have to at least be somewhat independent as it relates to our national security needs from other countries for these computer chips. They have to be trusted. That is, you can't have any things embedded in them by the Chinese or others if they're going to go into your nuclear missile submarines, if they're going to go into your radar systems and so forth. But what you very quickly discover when you analyze this is in order to have the capacity to manufacture the very high-end logic chips that go into our weapons platforms, you need to achieve the scale required to invest in the R&D in an ongoing basis. You also need the manufacturing expertise that only comes with making the commodity chips that go into phones and toys and so forth. So you have to reconstitute much of the entire ecosystem if you're going to become national security independent on chips. Now that's the national security nexus, which I think is the strongest argument for chips and science. But there's also, I think, a more accessible argument, which is, wait a second, don't we have like millions of jobs in this country that are dependent on a robust auto manufacturing industry? Of course we do. A lot of good wages, a lot of communities revolve around the local auto plant. A lot of communities revolve around the very extended supply chains that are associated with those auto plants. And isn't that valuable to us just from a civic standpoint? Shouldn't we support those communities? Absolutely, we should be supporting them. Well, they need computer chips, and they need a reliable supply of computer chips, even when a global pandemic hits, or God forbid, they need them if there's a geopolitical event, and the Chinese decide to seize a major island that happens to be home to so many computer chips, like Taiwan, right? So these arguments, as I've just sort of laid out, I guess you asked me earlier how I make the case. This is how I make the case. And then if there's sort of wonky economic arguments, I go down to another layer of complexity. But I think most Americans get this. It doesn't fit, it doesn't dovetail nicely into government should never be involved in the economy sloganeering. But we're not paid to sloganeer in the end. We're paid to make to discern and to make hard arguments to our constituents, and then if you do that over a period of time, you might actually earn the trust of your constituents and make this whole place work.
Do you think chips are unique in this respect, or are there other things kind of in the queue in your mind?
I think there are other things that will be required, but I'm very reluctant to volunteer what those things should be. I'm not eager to jump into industrial policy and a whole array of verticals. So let's start with the national security argument. If someone can make a very strong national security or economic security, that is, we can't have the supply chains interrupted because it'll impose a cost beyond the firm or the individual level to extend to entire communities, then I'm open to that argument. So what might some of these areas be? Aviation might be one of those areas. We need to maintain strength as it pertains to aviation. We need to continue to have a vibrant life sciences ecosystem. Now, I've just identified two areas that have a very clear and very direct nexus to our national security. When you start to move beyond that nexus, I grow uncomfortable. And I'll go back to the word discernment. We just, at some point, you'll have to make a call. These things don't lend themselves to formulaic answers always.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you choose those three. This is, something that we've been very interested in and studied, looking at American policy in the 20th century, where, notwithstanding the claims that we were some Hayekian, paradise of some sort, it was very clear the federal government had chosen three areas where the U.S. absolutely had to lead, and they were life sciences, aerospace, and electronics. And first of all, it's very interesting to see, in a sense, to the extent it counts as picking winners, to notice that aerospace is probably important.
How many winners have we picked in the tax code? Like, how many winners have we chosen? And I challenge anyone to tell me from an economic standpoint, not a congressional budget office or a joint tax standpoint, but an economic standpoint, why direct expenditures are different than tax expenditures. So we do this all the time. And the question should be, is that a wise strategic bet by government? Is it a wise strategic bet to say, the market's not giving us enough research and development? We want more, so we're going to create a tax incentive. And so I think we should grow a lot more comfortable trusting our judgment and going back to the models that we're taught to inform that judgment, but not allowing those to become sort of superficial crutches,
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And the other thing that
like the Garmins that take us into cul-de-sacs, right? Stop looking at your phone at some point, right? Stop looking at your phone. It's a cul-de-sac. Turn around, right?
Unless you're surfing AmericanCompass.org, you'll find Rebuilding American Capitalism available in mobile form.
Right.
But no, it's also interesting thinking about some of the policies you were speaking about at the outset. It strikes me that to the extent we can embrace policies that make industry broadly more attractive and let the market figure out what and how to invest, but making things relatively more attractive than whatever else we have an awful lot of people spending their time on today, that's also a way out of the cul-de-sac, in that it gets us what we want and need in terms of the industrial strength, the research, the jobs, the communities, without having to slide too much beyond those few core industries into just into every corner of the economy.
Yes, so I'd agree with that statement. I also think, and I may be stirring the pot a little bit here, but that's the intention.
Please do.
I think the thing that the Biden administration has been missing most as it pertains to their industrial policies is trade. If we're going to engage in a strategic decouple from China, and there's really a national security imperative to do so, why don't we double and triple down on our trade relations with other countries with whom we are coordinating in our own production strategies, right? There should be concentric circles of trust. The most high-end logic chips that go into our nuclear weapons platforms need to be made here. They need to be radiation hardened. They need to be trusted microelectronics, like the very ones that are tested at Crane, Indiana. But no, they really do. But other things that are important to our economy, but maybe we could sustain ourselves for an extended period of time in the midst of shortage. Maybe we can trust the Canadians to produce those, right? Or the Japanese. So let's work together collectively and pool our economic strength vis-a-vis the CCP, because they can never keep up if we do that.
I don't trust the Canadians at all, but the others, the others I'm on board with. No, it's
dog whistle, right?
That's the core of the populist agenda is the Canadian fight. I think that point about the sort of concentric circles is really important, and there's the element of sort of nearshoring that rightly gets a lot of attention. It's also very interesting in the context of what the Trump administration did, and one thing the Biden administration carried forward, which is the very targeted tariffs on particular categories of Chinese goods. And some people have looked at that and said, well, it didn't close the trade deficit, so it didn't work. But if you look at the things we put the tariffs on, imports from China on that stuff plummeted. And so is that something you would want to see more of as we think about the strategic decoupling, is basically doing whatever it takes to force that production out of China, but recognize there are a lot of places it can go?
I certainly would be comfortable with that if I saw a robust diplomatic effort to try and ensure we bring the Europeans and the Japanese in particular along with us, other large economy blocs and countries, because otherwise we're just stealing market share, right? The U.S. will self-indulgently apply the tariffs or remove ourselves from accessing the Chinese market, and the Europeans will swoop in and steal market share. So you have to find your way around that dynamic, and I think the only way is through robust diplomacy. But yes, if.
Yeah. All right, I want to spend a couple minutes on non-competes, because it's such a great, concrete, tangible issue. Everybody understands. Everybody's sat down to start a job, and right before they can start, pile of papers is slunked down in front of them that they're expected to sign. Who knows what's in it? Even if you do read it and realize you don't like what's in it, what are you going to do? Get up and walk away and say, never mind? It's one of those places where the Chicago school philosophy seems so obviously to fall on its face, and yet I think there's still, I mean, you're trying to push the legislation. There is still that resistance, that idea that, well, but wait a minute, in the market, workers will go to employers that don't have non-competes if they don't like non-compete. I think that's the argument.
Yeah. Our job is, in large measure, to define the parameters of the market. In this case, the terms of the employment relationship. And then after having defined those parameters and from time to time redefine them, sure, we allow the market to work, but this is about the freedom to leave. I've worked for multiple employers where they had an unquestioned ability. I was an at-will employment relationship. So they could terminate me if they didn't like my political views, if they didn't like how I dressed, if they didn't like me for whatever reason at a particular moment, any day. So under those terms, and there's reasons we have those sorts of employment relationships, it makes our labor market pretty efficient, unless you trap employees in that relationship and don't give them the freedom to leave and apply their skills where they can be applied, where there's the most economic value added, in a place that is consistent with their dreams and aspirations, or allow them to leave and go start their own business somewhere, which is really how most economic development these days occurs. So having laid that predicate, I mean, this makes lots of sense. The vast majority of the American people will be with us on this. It's not as though this is something I dreamed up, right, this reform idea. What I've just laid out, this freedom to leave, has long been the law of the land in Oklahoma, in California. For all its faults and problems, the state of California does not lack for innovation. North Dakota, so three states, Oklahoma and North Dakota, California, that have very different economies from one another. And I've looked into this. There have been no grievances, to my knowledge, about this from employers, because these functioning labor markets provide an ongoing, flood of employees to employers who folks want to work for. I mean, that's just how this works. Attorneys, having been an attorney for a short period of time and having advised new businesses in particular about the sort of legal structures they should set up, I understand why they recommend to business people to have their employees sign a non-compete. It's not only in the employer's economic interest, but it is a broad and highly inclusive legal instrument. It is overbroad and over-inclusive. So the reservations that are vocalized by some business leaders are, they're going to steal all my intellectual property. No, they're not. We have existing trade secrets law. Well, it's a sales business. They're going to steal my sales lists. We have non-solicitation agreements, which are much narrower. So there are existing legal instruments that can fill these narrow concerns, and that's what we need to move to. The FTC has acted some, but I think this is an area where Congress really needs to speak. The GAO just produced a report in this area indicating that non-competes can constrain the wages the rank-and-file workers get, reduce the rate of business creation, impinge upon our labor mobility at a time when so many businesses really need it. And we've seen in states where non-competes are enforced vigorously that they have much higher rates of business failure for the first few years, and then those businesses that make it past year 5 aren't as large as businesses similarly situated in states where there's not a lot of non-compete enforcement. So the evidence is there, and we're just in the process of trying to get members of Congress to act.
Final
Thanks for the
question.
platform.
That was actually final question. It segues well into a final question. I think I've been struck in your work generally, even in these answers, you are focused on building coalitions and consensus and actually getting things done. I'm more of like I'm just going to say what I think and ever, go pound sand kind of guy, which I say is a compliment to you, to be clear. But something that you highlight there in the non-compete context is the business community. And whereas historically Republicans, conservatives have been sort of very tightly aligned with business interests, there's a sense that they're sort of breaking up now. And yet on something like non-competes, the ideal outcome isn't a breakup. It is a mutual understanding that businesses aren't really being reasonable in a sense. They don't actually, to your point, need this instrument, and there's sort of a better way forward that ideally they could get on board with in a sense. And I'm curious how that goes. How do you find actually bringing the business community along to recognize that some things do have to change?
Well, I'll sort of wrap where we began, and it was the University of Chicago. University of Chicago, not only this sort of libertarian economic school, Hayekian in nature, but it's also where much of behavioral economics germinated, right? People forget that. And I think, and this is something I also had the opportunity to discuss at the school, I think that the most powerful bias I'm aware of that we have sort of baked into our DNA is status quo bias. And it's hard to overcome, but the only tool we really have at our disposal to address it is self-awareness, and if you're relying on someone else to help you out, persuasion. So I try and bring facts to the table, and it's amazing how many business people respond to facts if you have the courage to present them with uncomfortable facts. Sometimes it takes a couple of conversations. Sometimes it takes following up with supporting evidence, and there's a risk to having these conversations, right? A risk that someone will never support you again, a risk that they'll share with others things that aren't entirely accurate, anti-business or something. But generally, you can not only win these arguments, but you can bring others into these arguments and provide them a measure of reassurance that you're going to address their fears. People are generally, in my experience, they don't shy away from change per se. They fear loss. And if you can tell them you're really not going to lose much, in fact, you might gain, then you'll address their concerns. And we owe this to our workers. We owe this to our community. If we want to be faithful to real capitalism, which ensures that not only our businesses, but also our consumers and workers and other stakeholders are empowered and sustained support throughout our country for capitalism, we need to make these arguments. And you help us do so, particularly on the home stretch of the CHIPS and Science Act, Oren, when you piped up, and this was, I think, a couple of days before the vote, and folks were just going crazy, and many knew that we had to get this thing passed for the good of the country, but they were experiencing great consternation and maybe looking for an off-ramp. And we had a prominent newspaper, which I may have mentioned earlier, is sort of reductive editorializing at the 11th hour. And I think you're about the only scholar who really leaned in and said, listen, the emperor has no clothes. Here's why. CHIPS and Science is in the best interest of the country. So I thank you for that. Let's continue to do some good together.
Thank you so much, Senator. Really appreciate you being here, and looking forward to working together.
Thank you. Thanks.
We're back for Act 2. I am delighted to introduce Senator Marco Rubio. I have to very briefly tell a funny story. He is the first senator I ever spoke with, actually. I was a lowly management consultant and had managed to write a piece for National Review and got an email from Senator Marco Rubio's staff saying, Senator Rubio is very interested in anti-poverty policy and wants to talk with you. And that just blew me away. And ever since, I have been feel incredibly privileged to have the chance to work with him, to learn from him about the incredibly difficult job that he has, and hopefully to do our part at American Compass to help with I think the incredible work that he has been doing, really pushing forward so much thinking on the right of center on conservative economic policy. So Senator Rubio, thank you so much for being here. I, of course, neglected introducing you to mention your new book, which has just come out, Decades of Decadence, which I think really does an impressive job pushing the ball forward a little bit on sort of developing an explanation for what on earth has gone wrong and how we need to think about what to do about it. So I thought that might actually be a useful place to start, is just talk a little bit about why you know, books are not easy or fun. Why you wanted to do one and what you hope it accomplishes.
It's a good question. I mean, the book is probably, I don't say the culmination, but it's the product of like a 5 to 6 year process in my own life. I always tell people, if you're not evolving like in your principles, but evolving in your view of the world, learning new things, being exposed to new things, you're not alive. It's a part of life, and you know, certainly I have a different view on things like outside of politics that I did 25 years ago. You know, I understand my parents better as my kids get to a certain age. Now I understand why they said or did certain things. In fact, I oftentimes remind myself of my own parents, and I tell my kids that all the time. One day you'll look back and remember this, and I think it's the same is true for politics. I'm a product of the late 20th century, early 21st century American conservatism. That's where I grew up, and it was the world where Ronald Reagan was president, the Cold War, I guess with Reagan when I was growing up, and then George H.W. Bush. And the Cold War had ended, so understand something like this adversary that our entire life had been built around. If you lived in the 80s or grew up in the 80s, you know that like the scary movies about the end of the world, they all revolved around some war with the Soviet Union. All that just vanished overnight, like the Berlin Wall comes down. And the argument is, guys, we won the Cold War, and now everyone is going to be a democracy, and everyone's going to be a free enterprise economy. And it sounded great. And there was reason to believe it and reason to be hopeful of that. I think there's a couple things that were missed in the euphoria of that moment. The first is that nationhood has always mattered. The idea that being citizens of the global economy, you know, was that somehow that would replace nation state and the importance of place and things of that nature was pretty silly. There's no evidence in 5,500 years of recorded human history that people don't need to belong particularly to a place, but it's one of the most basic of human desires is to belong to something. That's why no matter where you put people, they immediately start creating groups and organizations and so forth. So I think that was a mistake. And I think the second, and embedded in that mistake was also the notion, which is where the decadence piece comes in, that we are now America, we're a sole superpower, everything's going our way, we can do whatever we want. In fact, we have so much runway that we can actually go crazy and decide that all these things that are true are no longer true, all these things that work or actually don't work anymore, and in fact are inherently evil and so forth. And the two things kind of start moving together on the cultural side and on the economic side. On the economic side, clearly, I think the right of center is as guilty as the left of center on the idea that somehow we are all now just consumers and investors in this global economy. Because when you believe that, then it really doesn't matter where you make things. If the market says, take this factory and take those jobs and move it overseas because that's the most efficient use, and the product and the end product is going to be more profits for the investors and lower prices for the consumer. Left unanswered, of course, is, well, what happens to all those people whose jobs went away? Of course, for a long time, the answer was, well, they're going to learn how to code, and they're going to, or they're going to go out and find an even better paying job. And that clearly didn't happen. And the result wasn't just unemployment. It was corrosive and destructive and undermined entire communities. I mean, it just pulled the soul out of them. J.D. Vance obviously wrote a book about that and does a great job of explaining it. I know he'll be here later. And it really touches on the impact of that beyond just economics. And then embedded in that on the cultural side is the idea that some of these most fundamental elements and pillars of a functioning society really didn't matter anymore. Things like family and community, that somehow we found our strength now in government or in the, and so we're left to people out there like desperately in search of belonging, but told you can't belong to a country because it's not patriotic. There's no, patriotism is actually a bad thing, and America is not a country who has a great history to begin with. That's the argument. Family is whoever wants it to be. There's the actual notion of family is not nearly as important as some of these other things. So you begin to undermine all of those things as well that hold the culture together, and now it's just a full-blown cultural hysteria. Again, both a product of this incredible success that creates the idea that we can do whatever we want. Well, hindsight 20, 30 years, it mattered a lot, because we now find that not only did we create these pockets of despair in America, but we also have found ourselves deindustrialized and unable to make things we invented. So we passed things like this, well, I didn't vote for it, but we passed for this fake Inflation Reduction Act, which is you got to buy batteries, you got to buy solar panels, but they're all made in China. We innovated it, but now we find the only way to meet the demands of that bill that we passed is to make them in China. And we have this very dangerous pharmaceutical. I'm just touching on a handful of things. I mean, the list is long and extensive about the shortages we face. We deindustrialized America because we were now going to be the people that invented things. We created an unbalanced economy, and what I mean by that is it's an economy where the pillars of it are services and finance. And there's nothing wrong. These are not cocaine dealers. I mean, it's not illegal to be in finance or in services, but you can't be a great power if you don't have industrial capability. And of course, we're ignoring the impact that jobs and all that have as well. So we have an unbalanced economy in that way. And so I think we're really at a very important inflection point. And for the challenge for people like me, right, I grew up in that era where the market was always the answer, and I still believe in the market. I still believe that generally the market outcome is the right market, is the right outcome. I think the challenge has to be now, what do you do when the market outcome and the national interest are in conflict? Because the market says it is more efficient to make medicine in China, basically make anything in China. But it's not in our national interest. So, and it's certainly not in our national interest to create these pockets of despair as well in America. So what do you do? And that's the piece of policymaking that I think was lost, and that is putting the national interest at play in making these decisions. We weighted as solely an economic function and did not look at the broader point of view. And for government officials in particular, that's problematic, because our job is, first and foremost, our obligation to the country. And our view, I believe, has to be America is not a market. Market is a tool. It is a tool that we use to strengthen America and improve American lives. It is a better tool than socialism and government, but it is a tool. The end game here is to support the country and our people, not to serve the market. And so the market's a tool, we do that. And when the two are in conflict, when the pure market outcome, when the lab outcome for the market is not good for the country, the only people on earth that can be expected to put the American interest above the market outcome is American policyholders. The corporate class isn't going to do that for a lot of reasons, and certainly other countries aren't going to do that as well. So we now find ourselves in a pretty precarious situation with a culture that I think is fracturing deeply in ways that make it difficult for us to rally around some of these concepts, and some real economic imbalances that are both dangerous to our national security and corrosive to our national life. And so finding a path forward on this that comes from the limited government point of view that I still hold has been one of the things I've really tried to embrace and work on over the last 5 or 6 years, not me alone, but it's a project that I think is starting to get some momentum, and I hope we can continue to build it. The last point I would make is this, There's a lot of things that aren't fun these days about this job, but the one thing that is that we are living in a moment of tectonic shift, a real realignment of politics internationally, but also domestically, where some of the traditional lines of the old political spectrum are being blurred a little bit, and where I think you can find some compromise between, or some solutions between people that may not agree on a lot of other things, but may find themselves sort of, for different reasons, believing in some of the same things I've outlined here now. So I do think there's this realignment of American politics, not just partisan realignment, but the ideological spectrum is evolving in a very interesting way that I think it's an exciting chance to be a part of trying to build a new governing consensus which our country needs. And so that's why I'm grateful for the work you guys do, because you've really provided a lot of the sort of intellectual work behind some of these ideas. And obviously our job is to go out and try to figure out how to apply it and operationalize it.
So what do you do?
That's longer than my book. My book's only 254 pages. I just basically...
That's read the book. So what do you do? I mean, you posed it sort of rhetorically. What do you do when you have these problems? We have we have piles of things you could do. What are you most excited about? What do you see as the main thing we need to do?
Yeah, I think the first question is and I think this is true of any challenge, is you have to answer the why. Why is this important? Because we are still basically hardwired to think like if the stock market's up or the stock market's down, that's good. And I think this concept that just because a company has an address in the United States doesn't mean that what's in their interest is America's best interest. Their investors are international, and at the end of the day, their number one obligation, in their view, is, appropriately so perhaps, is to their shareholders. My number one obligation is to our shareholders, which happens to be the people of the United States of America. That's who we're here acting on our behalf. And when the two are in conflict in our mind, the shareholders, the United States of America, the people of our country have to win out. So I do think we have to be careful about two things. The first is we have to be careful about how you define the national interest, because every industry will argue that they are in the national interest. And I think they can, not that any industry is irrelevant, but I do think that there's a hierarchy of things that are important in the 21st century because they're important to our security and also because they produce the kind of stable work that you need to have strong families and strong communities. So that's a tough task because everyone's going to hire lobbyists to convince us that they're in the national interest. And I try to stay away from singling out one industry versus another, but I will say that I think textiles and apparel are important. I think telecommunications and biomedicine is perhaps a little bit more elevated given I think we could survive wearing Chinese t-shirts, although I'd love to have at least Central American t-shirts so it's closer, but I don't think our country can survive as a great power if we depend on China for our medicine, any advances in medicine, telecommunications and technology and the like. So I think those are important. Likewise with agriculture, which a lot of people don't think about as a critical industry, but it really is. And so I think we have to do a better job of defining that. And I still think on my end, I can't, we have to be careful and guard against, because the left of center traditional response to any of this is, well, here comes the government. The government will run it. So we have to, there has to be a government role to play, but we have to make sure it doesn't overreach, or you end up passing, what's the bill that they passed, the semiconductor bill, which I was an original supporter of the idea that we should be in it. So I said, hey, by the way, if we're going to invest all this money, shouldn't we put some guardrails, right? Because they're already stealing our stuff. So before we turn over billions of dollars to make even more stuff, shouldn't we make sure they don't steal it? Because if they're stealing billions now and we invest billions more, they'll have billions more to steal. And I got tremendous pushback. It never made it in the bill because the companies that do this work and the researchers don't want those restrictions. They want to continue to collaborate. So we have to be careful about examples of industrial policy that end up being counterproductive. 5 years from now, when the articles are written about how the U.S. invested billions of dollars in semiconductors and it was all stolen by China anyways, no one's going to want to do industrial policy because it'll stigmatize it. So that'll be problematic. So that's the second thing we have to guard against. And then the third, frankly, is in my own party. The orthodoxy still is, in some circles, that the market will take care of all of this. And that may have been true when there wasn't a lot of options 40 or 50 years ago, but in the global market, the way it operates now, the market outcome isn't always going to be in America's national interest. There are some things, and we've always done that, by the way. The reason why Boeing exists, 50% of the revenue comes from the Department of Defense, because we decided a long time ago that we better build airplanes for the Air Force, so we shouldn't rely on China to make our airplanes. So I think it's important to understand we've always made these decisions on, I just think we're going to have to expand the industries that we define. But I still think there are obviously strong and powerful elements within the right of center that still cling to this 20th century notion, and many have built their lives or career around it, and others have just made a lot of money on it and don't want to give it up. So we have a lot of work to do. We're still the minority, but we're working on growing.
Yeah. China seems like the biggest challenge in some sense is also the most appetizing on-ramp for people who might be much more inclined to laissez-faire, free market in a lot of contexts, but they're ready to say, okay, but there's a problem with China. And so I think something like, the CHIPS Act example is really interesting. Right now, we basically have open season, or have historically had open season, go invest as much as you want in China. One question in the CHIPS Act was, okay, well, should we say certain companies, if they do certain things, can't invest in China? The Biden administration has made certain rules, maybe. How do you approach a question like that? Would you be inclined to just say, chip companies can't invest in China? Or how do we start to disentangle that?
Well, the way they've argued is they want to continue to make what they call legacy chips in China. The problem is money's fungible. Like once you provide investment to a corporate entity, even if they invest the actual dollar you gave them in America, it just frees up a dollar for them to continue to expand operations, and you're still building their industrial capacity. But I want to take one step back from that and say, look, China is the single most powerful rival, potential adversary the United States has ever faced in its history. It dwarfs anything the Soviet Union ever posed. And I was tough on China before it was cool, right? So everybody now has got a bill out there to be tough on China, and that's fine, and I don't have a problem with that. I think that's a dynamic that didn't exist a few years ago. But I don't want to be mistaken. This is not just about China, and that's the part I'm worried about. China is a piece of it. It's certainly the most prominent example, and it features prominently in the book. But it's not just about China. A lot of it is about us. We made the decision that we didn't want to be an industrial power anymore because industry was dirty, and industry was for people that didn't go to college, and industry was, can't make Netflix movies off of industry. We all wanted to be, stockbrokers and so forth, and whatever movies were out, lawyers, too many of those, even though I'm one, but I'm recovering. And so I think part of it is internal. We made policy decisions that are now, and the other is, it's not just limited to China. There is this rise of countries around the world that if you look at, if BRICS added, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, if they added a couple more countries, say Argentina and Saudi Arabia, you have 60% of the global economy, about 56% of GDP. It rivals the G7. And if they all decided we're going to start doing deals around the US dollar as the global reserve currency, that's a real threat. And there's two things that are conspiring. One is, and I've been a supporter of sanctions, but at some point you sanction enough people that you've created this entire marketplace of the sanctioned, which is big enough to conduct business around you to get around sanctions and things of that nature.
You put everyone in jail, and now all the criminals are together in
exactly.
jail.
It's now the biggest city in your state, right? And that's one of the challenges that we face. So I don't want to just say, one of the things that COVID did, I think most nations around the world have operated on the basis of the national interest. This idea that we should operate in the interest of the global economy is a Western phenomenon that China never bought into, the Russians never did, many others. And for most of these countries, it always made sense to act in the national interest. And they continue to do so, and we haven't. So I think one of the things you're now seeing is more and more countries, especially after COVID, when they ran out of things that they either made or had the capability of making, have now woken up to that reality and are becoming more, and this is a term that's been stigmatized, but nationalistic in their view of things. In essence, even in the West, particularly in Europe now, more and more nations are starting to think about like the national interest before the interest of even the EU and certainly the global economy. And we can't be left behind in that equation. That doesn't mean we don't want relations with other countries. That doesn't mean we don't want to isolate from, we want to isolate from the world. Those two things don't have to be true. We still can engage in the world, but I just think fundamentally every decision we make has to be a decision that's good for America. I can't imagine why we would make decisions that are bad for America because they somehow are good for somebody else. And for a long time, we were making public policy that way, and I think that's the bigger challenge. China's a product of that. It is, the Chinese leaders have done exactly what any rational leader of a nation state seeking to become a great power would do. They took advantage of all the benefits and none of the obligations of everything that we let them into. And they'll continue to do it as long as we let them do it. And, so I think as much as anything else, they are a product of not just the work they've done and the money they've invested, but what we've allowed them to continue to do for a long time.
So I take your point that China is illustrative of the challenge as opposed to being the challenge. What do you think that means for particularly the conservative coalition here in Congress or in America? You mentioned this way of thinking is probably still the minority at this point. Do you feel like there is progress in the right direction? Where is there progress versus where do you think there's the most resistance?
Well, I think in some sense for a long time, the way American politics, this is very simplified, okay? But the way American politics generally played out was if somebody was the head of a big company or had been very successful making money by investing money and they came and told you this is the way to guide our economy, we would say we need to listen to these people because they made a lot of money. But just because you know how to make a lot of money or just because you know how to make a corporation profitable in the global economy doesn't necessarily mean you know how to steer public policy for a nation state. Because oftentimes the interest of a nation state and the interest of a corporate entity are not just different, they're not aligned. And so I think that's one of the challenges we now face. I understand why Jamie Dimon or Elon Musk go to China and meet with the Chinese leaders because they have an interest there. And for the entity that they work for or own, there is a profit motive for it, but they're not public officials. I think for us as policymakers, just because somebody who's made a lot of money or is very successful at business thinks that something makes sense doesn't mean it does in the national interest. So it may make sense to them. And for a long time, that was a very powerful weapon that was used against us. I mean, especially on the right, because we didn't want to stand up to a group that was called the business whatever or the round table of whatever. And so they would come to DC and they would say, we're here on behalf of the business community and we think this is good for America because X, Y, and Z. And we would do it because they're the business people. And I think now there has to be that equation of, well, it might be good for your business, the way you're structured and what you particularly do, but is it also good for the country? We have to find that balance. I'm not seeking to wage war on these guys. I'm just thinking to bring some balance that leans towards the national interest. And I think that's going to be a real struggle for people on the center right who have long taken their cues by whether or not people on CNBC or Fox Business are freaking out that morning. The stock market is not irrelevant, but it is by no means a true barometer of the safety of our daily economic life or of the health of our economy as a nation. And yet, I think we put a lot of stock into things like that, no pun intended, and take our cues in that regard.
So final question, to this point about sort of what the coalition looks like going forward, I think you sort of described the right isn't going to be just sort of in lockstep with the business community as it used to be. On the other hand, if you lose the business community, somebody else has to come in and fill it, or maybe there's a way to reach détente with the business community. What do you see as the path forward that takes what you and I would both agree is the right way to think about things and actually make sure there is the necessary support for it?
Well, first of all, I think it's a misnomer to argue that we live in laissez-faire, like hands-off government. We already have laws that do things like taxes and regulation. And anytime you put laws in place, those laws incentivize and disincentivize behavior. So we already do that. All I'm arguing is that our incentives should now be built in the direction of serving the national interest. And our disincentives should be about being against things that are against the national interest. So anything that incentivizes a company to move its production of something really important to another country, whether it be high taxes or subsidies from the government, we shouldn't do. I don't think that puts us at war with the business community. I think the business community, by and large, will respond to whatever the conditions are. Some of these corporations are making a lot of money in America, a free society, and in dictatorial communist settings as well. They've figured out how to adjust to whatever the laws and conditions are in those marketplaces. So I don't think ultimately we find ourselves in a place where we're going to be hostile toward the broader business community, because they will respond to the conditions that are set. Whatever they are, they just want to know what those rules are, and they'll respond to those in ways that, if properly tailored, will be good for the country, but also good for economic growth, which is good for the country. I think the one place where there might be some friction is people that have invested a lot of money in companies or entities that are doing things like building weaponry in China or strengthening some capability China has. I think it makes no sense, for example, for the Thrift Savings Plan, which invests the money of federal employees and particularly of members of the military, are being invested in companies that are developing weapons to kill those members of the military, Like most people would say, don't invest my 401k money in a company designed to kill me. Or
It might maximize the return.
yeah, well, exactly. But you won't be around to get the return if they blow you up. So that makes, so in those cases, I do think there may be some conflict. And then look, a great example is this Uyghur Human Rights Act that we passed, which we're having a challenge now enforcing because, but nobody did it publicly. You didn't see a lot of commercials saying, stand up to Congress, tell them yes to slave labor. You know, nobody said that, but they really worked hard behind the scenes to not have it pass. You know why? Because they're making a product with labor that see no evil, hear no evil, you know, and it wasn't happening. But they had to have known that this was forced labor. That was, of course it was cheap, it was forced. And it allowed their price point to be lower and made them competitive in the marketplace. So I think there's an adjustment there. Our biggest challenge is going to be the American people. And the reason why is a lot of people would agree with us. Yeah, we got to be tough on China. We got to stand up to China, but don't take away my TikTok. Like, can't touch that, you know. You can't, what's Shein or whatever, like I still want to be able to buy that shirt for 19 bucks, even as we're tough on China. So I do think we're going to ask people to do things that are uncomfortable if we're going to act in the national interest that political leaders don't like to do. And so I think that also creates a dynamic that we're going to have to bear watching. But I don't think this puts us in a hostile position. But I do think that in the end, we have to view what's in the national interest. And the national interest isn't just national security from a traditional sense. It also involves, bottom line is this, guys. We're never going to be a strong country if we can't make things and if we don't have strong families that live in strong communities. It's that simple. Okay? We need those three things. America became strong because of those three things. We have undermined all three things. Not just neglected, openly undermined all three things. The authority of parents, the undermined community, or at least community as we understood it, and obviously looked away from our economic resiliency and our national security in that vein. So we're going to need I think it's a wake-up call that we are no longer in a position where we can do whatever we want and not have to worry about the consequences. We are no longer the only show in town. We have rivals and we have competitors who are near-peer adversaries in the case of China. And the world has changed, and we need to change with it and take that very seriously, or we are going to wake up one day and live in a world that's going to look very different than the one we grew up in. And then we won't be worried about decadence. It'll be panic and servitude, and the most powerful nation on earth will be a communist dictatorial regime, and the world will change as a result of it. The stakes are truly that dramatic.
Well, on that note.
Yeah,
Senator,
other than that, it's going good, you know, but I mean.
thank you so much, Senator, for everything you're doing. Really appreciate you being here. All right. For the grand finale, we have Senator J.D. Vance. Senator Vance is someone I'd known for a while before he was brave enough or crazy enough to actually run for Senate, and was unapologetically enthusiastic about the prospects of that campaign. But I have to say what he has accomplished already in just a few months wildly exceeded my expectations, and I would be hard-pressed to think of anyone who has accomplished as much, frankly, legislatively as quickly as he has managed to. He is very quickly changing a lot of debates here in Washington, and I think we are only at the beginning of what will hopefully be an incredible impact on policy in this country. So please join me in welcoming Senator J.D. Vance.
Good. So one of my favorite moments from the campaign trail, I'm going to embarrass one of my staffers, but I won't actually point him out, so you all can just think about who I'm talking about and laugh at them in the abstract, but not precisely. One of my favorite moments of the campaign is someone was in our office, our Cincinnati headquarters, and was eating something sweet, and my body guy said to this person, "A moment on the lips, forever on the hips," which is a phrase I've used commonly. I just made eye contact with him, putting an entire brownie in his mouth. So I'll repeat: a moment on the lips, forever on the hips.
Well, that was going to be my first question. So thank you for getting that out.
Yeah.
Of the way.
Anyway, thank you for having me. It's good to see you. It's good to see so many bright, smiling faces. Some familiar, some unfamiliar. But I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, and I'm glad to be here.
Well, really appreciate it. We sort of penciled you down for whatever we hadn't covered by the time you got here.
Great. Glad to be cleanup.
Cleanup in the best sense of the word. But no, the two things I was hoping we could touch on in particular that are something we write a lot about in this book. One is financialization and what's going on.
Yep.
Sort of Wall Street versus the real economy. It was years ago I recall hearing you make this point that stuck with me. You know, the best neuroscientists in America, if they're maximizing their own interests, are working on addictive algorithms right now. How do you diagnose, you were in industry, how do you diagnose what's actually going on with capitalism in a sense? Are we getting investment where it needs to go, or if not, why not?
Yeah, so there's always a question about whether this is the chicken or the egg that we're talking about here, but let me sort of sketch out the problem and kind of how I see this shaking out. So the point that you're pointing out, or the point that you're reminding me of is, so when I was in Silicon Valley, one of the things that we tried to invest in was sort of next generation technology companies, and we largely tried to avoid the sort of business to business software as a service companies that were dominant in the Valley, where you're trying to take some sort of marginal business process, automate it with software, scale the product very quickly, and then sell it to a private equity firm for between $2 and $5 billion. That wasn't interesting to us. It sort of wasn't our theory of the case for how best to allocate capital. And I remember I was on Willow Road, which is the exit on Highway 101 in Northern California, where if you sort of take it to its logical extension and also its physical extension, you end up in the Facebook headquarters, which at the time was sort of booming, right? I mean, Facebook's going through some business struggles right now, but in 2014, 2015, this was sort of the center of the Silicon Valley tech economy. You could literally show up and get free $400 headphones as the guest of an employee, much less as the employee himself. And and of course I took advantage of that. And I remember going to a couple of companies on Willow Road or right off of Willow Road that were trying to solve the most important healthcare problems that we face. And in my view, the single most important healthcare problem that we face in this country is that you have people who are living 10, 15 years longer at the high end than what they were living before, and yet our brains aren't living nearly as long, or at least we're not getting nearly as much high quality cognitive power out of our longer lifespans. And so this is a huge, huge problem for us to solve. Now, if you're a neuroscientist, you can make, if you're lucky, $180, and this is in 2014, 2015, $180,000, more like $150,000, working in a neuroscience startup that was trying to figure out how to solve the Alzheimer's problem. And yet, if you were willing to go just a little further down the road, you would make twice that much or maybe 3 times that much developing highly addictive predictive algorithms for Facebook. And this struck me as a massive, massive market failure. And the traditional free market response to this is, well, clearly this is what people value more if they're willing to pay 3 times as much for a neuroscience to addict you to to build an application that addicts you, but they're only willing to pay $150,000 for solving Alzheimer's, then clearly that is just the proper allocation of capital, is to pay the neuroscientist to addict us to these applications. And it kind of hit me just as an obvious problem. And even if this was somehow the outcome of a pure efficient market, which I don't think that it is, but even if it was, then we should be able to say common sense is we care more about solving Alzheimer's than we do about addicting 12-year-olds to Facebook, so we should be trying to find ways to pay that neuroscientist more to solve the most important problems. That's sort of fundamentally, when I think about industrial policy, that's what I think it fundamentally is recognizing where we need to direct our country's resources to solving real problems as opposed to fake problems, or even solving problems in a way that creates more problems. Now, the interesting question, Oren, is why is it like this, right? Why is the Facebook engineer making so much more money to work on something that I think is fundamentally socially invaluable? And I think most Americans would probably agree with me. And one of the fundamental issues here is that there has been a massive return to financialization and digitization, and there's been much, much less return as a capital allocator or as an employee to some of these other things. In other words, it makes pure economic sense if you're viewing this from the perspective of a neuroscientist to go and work at Facebook than to go and work in solving Alzheimer's. Or to take another example, if you're a really, really smart mathematical mind, Does it make sense to go and, let's say, develop fusion energy and figure out how to solve the world's most important energy problem? Or does it make sense to go and work at a quantitative hedge fund where you develop complex trading algorithms? Well, if you're looking at it from a pure financial returns perspective, you would be an idiot to have gone to work on fusion energy 20 years ago, but you would have been really smart if you had gone and worked at Citadel or at Renaissance or at one of these things. So there's clearly a very fundamental problem here. And I guess the worry that I have, to throw a little bit of cold water on sort of my own views and just play devil's advocate a little bit, is maybe the reason that we have more people going to work on addicting kids to apps and quantitative trading algorithms has a little bit more to do with the fact that we're just a structurally stagnant society technologically. And it's not just the incentives of the individual marketplace. It's a much, much deeper and harder problem to solve. And I think the truth is there's probably sort of both sides of that are true. In other words, it's really, really hard to solve the Alzheimer's problem. That's one of the reasons why neuroscientists aren't solving it. It's really, really hard to solve the fusion energy problem. That's one reason why you have all these smart mathematical minds going to Renaissance. But it is a problem fundamentally of incentives too. And the thing that we can fix is the incentives. We can't make it easier to scientifically discover the solution to the Alzheimer's problem, but we can align the incentives better so that the smartest people are working on the problems that are most worth solving.
And so what does that look like? Is that, I think to your point that at the end of the day, what industrial policy means is noticing the things that matter, the problems that actually need solving, and getting the talent and the capital there. The problem, I think, to throw cold water on my own ideas is like, we don't really have some agency that's gonna that's gonna nail that necessarily. And so, how do you, from your perspective, start to think about not what the legislation is, but even the directions that are on your mind that you're exploring?
Well, this is. There are a lot of different answers to this question, right? So one of the things that I think is definitely wrong with corporate America is that you have much less capital investment in long-term outcomes than you used to maybe 30, 40, certainly 60 or 70 years ago. So one thing is corporate America is just much more risk averse from a pure capital allocation perspective. But let's be honest, corporate America is much more risk averse from a sort of corporate culture perspective, right? So one of the things that's going on here to sort of meld my economic views with a little bit of culture war analysis is we've done a lot of things to human resources departments. We've done a lot of things when it comes to issues like affirmative action that have made, I think, a lot of companies much less willing to take on risks and have changed the corporate culture in a way that you have far fewer people who are just raw, let's figure out the problem, let's try to put a lot of money to it, and let's try to make a lot of money out of solving that problem. And you have a lot of people who are terrified of their own shadow in corporate America, right? That's like a human resources issue. And by the way, I think that our human resources regime, the entire sort of American legal regime behind it's probably made that problem worse. But then there's another sort of very easy problem or sort of easy way of thinking about this problem, which is it's like fundamentally a problem of incentives, right? So, how you do this, there are a lot of different questions about how you can make financialization pay less and solving real problems pay more. And we're sort of starting to think about some things in our office about how we would solve that. I'm sure that you've thought in some detail about this. And this is something I expect to be working on quite a bit over the next 2 to 3 years. But at a fundamental level, the problem is pretty straightforwardly put. We need to make working on real things pay more money than it does right now. And we need to make working on fake things pay less money than it pays right now. That's the fundamental problem. It is purely an incentive problem, or at least to the extent that we can solve it or at least help it from Washington, D.C., it's reasonably straightforward an incentive problem. And I think that's one thing we can fix with better public policy.
And it's interesting, there are two sides to that, whether you want to call it the sort of make it pay more, make it pay less, or the carrot and the stick.
Yeah.
I think people are, particularly politically, a lot more comfortable starting to inch into we need to make some good things pay more.
Yes.
We'll talk about, there's a market failure here, we need to reward X. And a lot less comfortable inching into that doesn't look so great. We probably should make that pay less. I understand that political calculation. I would also argue to some extent, though, that from a policy function perspective, it is frankly a lot easier to make some things pay less. And so I'm curious to what extent you have preferences for one or the other. You see it as a both and. What are you comfortable seeing government do in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of, look, I mean, I ran my campaign as a very non-conventional Republican, which has its downsides, and I've governed to the extent that we've done much governing in the past 6 months in this country in a very non-conventional way. I'm sort of comfortable saying both and. I am not, and look, even some of my Republican colleagues who are aligned with us on a lot of these issues would sort of be terrified at the suggestion that maybe we should actually penalize American corporations for offshoring American jobs, okay? Make it pay more. I think we should be doing that. Now, there are people who are terrified of that implication. I think it was in my opening speech I proposed a tax on corporations that ship American jobs overseas. So I'm much more okay with that. I'm much more okay with that stuff. And you know, the basic formulation, and I think even our sort of hyper-libertarian economics friends would agree with this basic formulation, is you get more of what you subsidize and you get less of what you tax, right? So let's tax the things that we want to see less of, and let's subsidize the things we want to see more of. And I think on net, it will probably equalize. I don't want to see a substantially larger federal government, in part because I think the federal government is so bad at these things. And this is one really big issue with industrial policy writ large. I had this conversation with Jared Bernstein recently, and Jared Bernstein is, you know, I don't know that I would call him a friend, certainly an acquaintance. He and I have interacted a lot. I think he's a very smart guy. I think he's probably one of the best people we could have gotten out of the Biden administration as chief economist, but I voted against his confirmation. Why did I vote against his confirmation? For the very simple reason that he leaned way too heavily into all the woke bullshit. And I'm sorry if I'm not allowed to say this in this room, this august room, and here I am cussing and dropping four-letter words.
We
but
have babies in the back.
We do actually. I'm so sorry. Luckily, the babies that I've seen, and I'm glad that they're here. God bless you guys. They're too small to repeat the things that I say, which, by the way, is not true of my 3-year-old, who's very, very into repeating the things that Daddy says, and it gets me in all kinds of trouble. He dropped the F-bomb on an airplane the other day. Bad situation, but. The issue here is, okay, so I would have voted for the CHIPS bill. I think the CHIPS bill is very good for the state of Ohio. I think it is one of the most critical things that we can do to migrate more semiconductor manufacturing to the United States of America and to allied nations. Okay, start with that premise. But when Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, is taking the language in the CHIPS bill and conditioning the money that comes out of the CHIPS bill on, you need to do the things that I want you to do on paid family leave, on diversity, equity, and inclusion, you do two things. One, you use good sort of policy at the high level to accomplish very terrible things in the actual application, right? There are a lot of things that Gina Raimondo is trying to use the CHIPS bill for that I think is not just not good, it's actively bad. But then the second problem that you cause is that you distract and destroy the political willpower for something that 90% of the country thinks that we need to do. No one in Ohio, even Republican primary voters who have voted in every Republican primary for their entire lives, no one cares that the Wall Street Journal editorial board doesn't like the CHIPS bill on free market economic grounds. But here's the problem, they really don't like it when the Secretary of Commerce forces them or their suppliers or a company in their community to adopt a diversity, equity, and inclusion program because of the money that the CHIPS bill authorized, right? So we have to be really careful about this. And to our friends on the left who are sort of open to a lot of the ideas that you've been pushing for pretty much as long as I've known you, the way to destroy right-of-center willpower for anything that looks like industrial policy is to use industrial policy to get progressive social policy through the back door, what you could never accomplish through the front door. And that's the big risk of the Biden administration. There are some things, I will say, at least rhetorically, where I think the Biden administration has picked up on a lot of the good that the Trump administration has done and ran with it. But if you're going to use the CHIPS bill to force Intel and Intel suppliers to adopt a diversity, equity, and inclusion program that's offensive to 60% of Ohio voters and 90% of Republicans, you're going to destroy the willpower to do what we need to do in this country. And that's the biggest risk of the Biden administration. They're actively making it harder for us to make these arguments, because every time we do something good, or at least a lot of the times we do something good in this building, they screw it up with the way they implement it.
So I agree entirely with that. I was in a very interesting panel discussion with Congressman Ro Khanna, who I think is generally sympathetic to a lot of the same thinking you or I might have, and either very genuinely loved the child care and DEI requirements in the CHIPS regs, or had a D next to his name and had to support them. But this point that you made, that doing that it's bad in the specific, but is catastrophic in what it means for the prospect of actually making progress on this, I think is an incredibly important point. And what I've been struck by talking with sort of my counterparts on the left who are interested in industrial policy and, big Inflation Reduction Act types, they were genuinely stunned that anyone was even upset about this. They were like, this is how government power works. Obviously, when we are in power, this is what we get to do. And I'm curious, I think you've importantly made a real mark reaching across the aisle and finding place of common ground. Have you had any of these conversations with folks on the other side? And is there any prospect of reaching a point where people understand, if we're going to get things done, we have to leave some of this other stuff to the side?
Yeah, so let me say two things. Number one, there is broad agreement on exactly that point, that to get some of these things done, we have to leave some of the progressive social policy, agree or disagree, and I obviously disagree with nearly all of it. We have to leave some of that stuff to the side. I think Jared Bernstein recognizes this, especially when you talk to him one-on-one. I think that a lot of my colleagues in the Senate recognize this, again, especially when you talk to them one-on-one. They know that there are things that we agree on and there are things that we disagree on, and if you use the things that we agree on to sort of subversively get something we disagree on in the public policy arena, that's going to make it very hard for us to ever work together. Now, at the same time, look, the reality is exactly as Roe and as others, or I'm not saying you're necessarily imputing this view to Roe, but whoever said this, it is fundamentally the truth that when the bad guys rule the government, they get to do the things that they want to do. And when the good guys rule the government, they get to do the things that they want to do. And the problem with, frankly, some of our interlocutors on the right is that their worldview appears to be that every time Republicans gain a governing majority, they have to sit on their hands and do nothing with it, acknowledging that whenever the left gets a governing majority, they're going to do exactly what they want to do with it. Well, that just means that we lose, but a little bit more slowly than we would otherwise lose. And the counter-argument I make, even though, look, I really, again, want to emphasize that what Secretary Raimondo is doing with the CHIPS bill is really bad news for a whole host of reasons. The counter-argument to the idea that, well, we can't give the power to government, we can't give any power to government because then the left might misuse it, is to look at the United States military. Right? If your argument is Gina Raimondo may misuse the CHIPS bill, therefore we cannot do the CHIPS bill, well, I guess we should abolish the Department of Defense because Joe Biden's doing a lot of crazy crap with the Defense Department that I don't think that he should do. Does that mean we shouldn't have a U.S. military? No, it means we should advance a political program that's popular and that can win so that when we win, we can get to do with the military what we want to do, okay? And in fact, the real solution here is to win a durable enough governing majority, not that we're going to win every election, but that the craziest stuff that the left tries to do, it stops trying to do because it realizes there are political downsides to doing it. I really do not think, for example, a majority of Americans, in fact, I'm quite confident that 70% of Americans don't think that their tax dollars should be going to do hormonal therapy for 19-year-old new enlistees in the United States military, okay? But in order for us to win that argument, we have to win political power, implement our agenda, and then be reelected. And that sort of is where I think maybe this whole conversation is most important. There is no path to a durable governing majority for the conservative movement that doesn't run through a rethinking of 1980s and 1990s economic dogma. For every... And I know, sort of the Trump question, of course, always leads to strong disagreements. But let me say this for Donald Trump, recognizing that not every person in this room is going to agree with me. The criticism that is made of Donald Trump from a lot of quarters, especially in this town, is, well, the problem that I have with Donald Trump is that he didn't win, right? We didn't win in 2018, we didn't win in 2020, and we didn't do as well as we should have in 2022. And my counterargument to that is, well, we did really, really well in 2008 and 2012. Oh, wait. We lost historic landslides in 2008, and we lost a pretty bad election in 2012, and the amount of public policy the Democrats were able to accomplish over the intervening decade has left its mark in a permanent way, okay? So the solution is not, oh, we need to go back to the pre-Trump consensus. Even if you don't like Donald Trump, and I obviously do, I think that he's done a lot of good for the country. Even if you don't like Donald Trump, the answer is not to go back to what came before him. That is a dead end. We've gone down that pathway a lot of times, and we always end up slamming our face into the walls.
Well, and on that note, thank you everyone for coming. I wanted to awkwardly and sharply shift topics, but I'm going to grab
Please.
your use of the phrase durable governing majority to make it seem like a smooth segue, because it would not be an American Compass palooza, I don't know what we call this, without a discussion of labor.
Yeah.
And I think you've really distinguished yourself as someone who is genuinely interested in the topic and the question of what are unions, what are the good things about unions, what are ways to actually constructively reform them, how can we bring more workers and union members into the conservative movement. I'm curious now that you're actually sort of unelected official, what your perspective on that is. Where do you see as the biggest opportunity?
Yeah, so let me address a couple of comments to some of our critics from the right who I think largely agree with us on things like maybe trade and immigration, but are very skeptical of the idea that labor will ever be aligned with the right of center. And you hear this a lot from sort of folks, they'll say, oh, J.D. Vance thinks the unions are going to be base. The unions are never going to be base. They're always going to be progressive and left-wing, right? Let me sort of say two things about this. One of them as a concession, one of them as a refutation. Okay, so the first point that I'll make is a concession, and that's that when I was running for my Senate race, there were a lot of union halls that I went and spoke to, and a lot of people who said, we're going to vote for you, our membership is going to vote for you, but the leadership literally will not let us endorse you, okay? So there is a problem, but the problem is not union membership, especially the trades unions, the builders, the carpenters, the electricians, and so forth. But there is a fundamental leadership problem. And I've asked this question to a number of labor lawyers. I've yet to get a good answer. But we have to figure out why it is that labor membership is increasingly on our side and labor leadership is increasingly aligned, or not increasingly, but is statically aligned with the left, right? I'm convinced that there is a structural reason why this is true. If you're a labor lawyer and you have an idea, please come to me, because I want to fix this problem. Because it's ridiculous if you have 70 to 80% of a given union in the Carpenters and Millwrights Union in Northeastern Ohio voting for J.D. Vance in 2022, and yet the national leadership is shoveling their union dues to the Democratic Party. Like, that is a fundamental unfairness. And we shouldn't just fix it because it's in our interest as Republicans. We should fix it because it's unjust and it's a problem. So we should sort of target that particular issue. On that point, and this is sort of the point where I think you and I agree, and where I think there is a real fertile ground for us. I mentioned the Carpenters and Millwrights Union in Northeastern Ohio. It was one of the few events before the general election that both Tim Ryan, my Democrat opponent, and me were both at. The door prize at the Carpenters and Millwright Union event was an AR-15. Okay? These are.
I'm just going to assume that's legal. I'm not going to ask how that.
That's a good question. I don't know. But these are our guys, ladies and gentlemen. These are increasingly our voters. They hate the woke BS. They hate the diversity stuff. They just want to go to their jobs, earn a good, livable wage for their families. They're fundamentally aligned with us on both issues of economics and of culture. And we just have to find some way to get them more and more on our side. Now, one story that I want to sort of give on this just highlights how much of an opportunity there is with labor. I was talking recently with the leadership of one of the largest airlines in America. and they were talking about a particular pilot rule. I'm one of these guys who's extremely concerned that, I don't like the diversity, equity, inclusion thing. Obviously, I brought it up like 4 or 5 times. You know where I really don't like it is with pilots, because my kids fly a lot. Their grandparents live in California, and obviously their dad's a senator in D.C., and they live in Cincinnati. I want my kids to have the 2 best pilots that they could possibly have every time they get into an airplane. So the diversity stuff, I don't like it when it comes to college admissions. I really, really hate it when it comes to airplanes. That's the scariest thing ever. Anyway. So, I was talking to the leadership of airlines, and I raised this issue. I said, look, a lot of the things that you guys are talking about, some policies you've already implemented, some policies you're thinking about implementing, these things could very well lead to lower qualified, lower standards in our pilot corps. And their response is to sort of try to poo-poo and avoid and not really discuss the question. And then the leadership of the airline says something that I think every conservative should take to heart. He said the reason why we can't really implement this stuff as much as we want to is because the pilot unions, black, white, Latino, the pilot unions of the membership of every skin color really hates this stuff. Okay, right? Whatever you're going to say about labor unions, as pissed off as I am that the national leadership of the Carpenter and Millwright Union didn't endorse me in 2022, if the labor unions are going to keep our pilots the highest safety standards, the highest quality possible, then we need to find some way to help them out. And we need to find some way to bring them into our coalition. Now, are there structural problems? I just mentioned those. Yes. Are there still some cultural problems that we have to get over? Absolutely. But fundamentally, labor should be on the side of the American right for the next generation, and it will be if we don't screw it up.
On that note, I promised the architect of the Capitol we would wrap up at 4. I assumed you'd rather hear from Senator Vance than some sort of vague conclusion from me. So I hope you found this very energizing, and we are abruptly going to conclude. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, guys.
Vance. Thank you very much.